Good morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to this week's Tropical Weather Outlook for April 4th, 2026. This is the first weekly video of April, and we are now continuing to get closer and closer towards the hurricane season. And because of that, we're going to talk more about hurricane season in these weekly Tropical Weather Outlooks now. And today, I'm going to talk about why this hurricane season in particular for this year, especially in the Atlantic Basin, may be different than the hurricane seasons we've been used to over the past several years. We've had a lot of active hurricane seasons recently, but especially if you've been monitoring how things have been shaping out in terms of the climate and in general factors for this year, you've probably heard by now that we are expecting an El Nino this year, and potentially a pretty strong one at that. And that's definitely going to change things up in terms of how this hurricane season will pan out, and is definitely going to be a different type of year than we've been used to over the last several years. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why and what exactly does that mean for how hurricane season might behave this year. So going to have a lot to talk about this for today's update. Hope you stick around, and if you do, I'm glad to have you. So with that being said, let's get started. First off, how many days are we now till hurricane season, at least in the Atlantic? And now that we are in the month of April, we are now less than 60 days away from hurricane season in the Atlantic, which starts on June 1st. We are even further down until the Eastern Pacific hurricane season starts, which begins on May 15th. We're probably somewhere in like the low 40s. And also, that's also when we also, start doing tropical weather outlooks on a daily basis in the Atlantic too. So really, you could say that the Atlantic hurricane season in technicality is much further along, and we're much closer to that than, June 1st. But of course, at least for now, that's the official barrier for when the Atlantic hurricane season starts. So that's what we're going with right now. So 58 days till then, and trust me, these 58 days are going to go by very, very quickly. Let's take a look now at the sea surface temperature anomalies right now across the Atlantic and the Pacific. One thing that we go over every week, and obviously we've been doing so for the past several weeks, and things generally remain the same in terms of how things have been panning out. We have our continuously building of the heat in the Pacific associated with what will soon eventually be an El Nino, and probably at this point in pretty short order. Probably within the next few weeks, things will really begin to warm up here enough so that we will reach El Nino threshold. And you can already see just how warm the Pacific is. We have this warmth here that is building off of South America, and especially in the subtropical Pacific off the coast of Mexico and the southwest U.S. here. Very, very, very warm patch building. As I've mentioned before, this is a very interesting piece of warmth here because this is something very different in the Pacific than what we've seen in recent years. For the past several years, this area here has usually been cold, even with the El Nino that we had several years ago. It was cold here, but this year it is warm, and that actually does have an influence, a positive influence in helping El Nino develop here in the Pacific. So very interesting things going on there. The warmth is building, and then meanwhile in the Atlantic side, it's generally not too bad in terms of warmth. There is most of the deep tropics of the Atlantic is near to slightly above normal, and we even have a few patches here of decent warmth off the coast of West Africa. But if you notice where the warmest anomalies are, they're concentrated in the subtropics, and we also have this cool tongue here as well in the Canary Current and off the northwestern coast of Africa. And usually in active hurricane seasons, this area tends to be much warmer. So already one major factor that is very different than what we've seen in the last several years. And these things combined, the general consensus is that this year is potentially going to be a below normal hurricane season for the Atlantic, especially because the El Nino out here is going to be strong, or at least that's what all the climate models say. Obviously, things could be different, but we're potentially looking at a strong El Nino this year combined with a not so favorable configuration of how the sea surface temperature anomalies are shaping up here in the Atlantic. So that might bring us a below normal hurricane season, and that is definitely different than how things have panned out over the last several weeks. And we'll definitely get a better idea as well of what exactly people are predicting for this hurricane season come next week, since we will actually get a number of hurricane season outlooks from a few pretty important prediction sources like Colorado State University and Tropical Storm Risk up in England or the UK. Both of them are gonna be releasing their forecasts next week, and by next Saturday, both of those forecasts will be out, and we will definitely review them and see how they match up to the current factors that are in place right now. And taking a look at the Pacific more in depth, the Nino 3.4 region right now is at negative 0.3 degrees Celsius, which is roughly this region right in here. And you can generally see this is still the coldest region of the Pacific right now in the sea of all the warmth here that you're really beginning to see build. And this anomaly is actually slightly cooler because of the methodology that NOAA now uses. It kind of reduces the sea surface temperature anomalies a little bit to kind of factor out any potential global warming influence that we might see in the sea surface temperature anomalies. But even then, especially if you look at this graph here, which is off to the side representing the Nino 3.4, you could generally see, especially over the last several months, how we've seen a gradual warming of the Nino 3.4 region occur, especially since the beginning of the year. Definitely a sign of El Nino coming. And why does El Nino cause a below normal hurricane season? Obviously, we talked about it briefly just a moment ago. But since we're going to see an El Nino this year, here is how the atmosphere is going to set up. Now, I'm mainly doing this to kind of describe, especially to those who are not really familiar with how all of these, big factors play out, especially like El Nino. But what we typically get in an El Nino is, obviously, as I just showed you here, a lot of warm water in the Pacific, building warmth, lots of heat in the ocean, which creates rising motion in the atmosphere, an unstable atmosphere. We get a lot of convective activity, thunderstorms. That generally is very favorable for activity, especially hurricane and tropical cyclone activity to occur in the Pacific. So we're going to have more than likely, we're going to have a below normal Atlantic, but definitely a very, very active Pacific this year, especially when you see this kind of warmth here off the coast of Mexico and the Baja Peninsula. That is definitely a huge glaring factor that this year is going to be very active in the Pacific. And I'll actually show you a graph to kind of represent how the basins behave hurricane season wise in just a moment. But we have a lot of rising motion in the Pacific that leads to sinking air, so not favorable conditions, stable air, not favorable for thunderstorms in the Atlantic as a result. And then you can see how things, behave on the flip side during a La Nina. And that's why we tend to say that La Nina especially is the most favorable pattern for Atlantic hurricane season activity, because the cooler waters tend to be in the Pacific, which allows for more rising motion in the Atlantic, especially when the Atlantic is very, very warm, as we have seen over the last several years, which is why for the last several years we've had very busy hurricane seasons, almost back to back, honestly, going back since at least 2016 or 2017. And it's mainly been because we've had La Nina after La Nina and a very, very warm Atlantic. And obviously, things are going to be different this year. And with El Nino, as things are more favorable in the Pacific, we have more hurricanes due to less vertical wind shear, because more of the favorable atmospheric conditions set up in the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, fewer hurricanes, stronger vertical wind shear, especially because of the outflow of all of the convection and thunderstorm activity we see in the Pacific, and obviously a greater atmospheric stability, which is not favorable for tropical development. And you can actually see that how the atmosphere is beginning to respond a lot more like an El Nino, even just over the next several weeks. And one way we can see it is through the MJO map that I like to look at very often, especially during these weekly outlooks, because the MJO represents And especially if you are a hurricane season guru by now, you know the MJO is representative of where all of the rising motion in the atmosphere is on a global scale. And notice, especially over the next several weeks, where we really see the MJO really amplify right now is in the Western Pacific. As we get towards mid-April, the MJO is expected to go into phase 6 pretty strongly, as well as into phase 7, and then eventually it's going to go into phase 8. And all of these regions of the MJO are in the Pacific, so we're going to have very strong rising motion set up, very favorable for El Nino. The SOI, too, something that we also go over on a weekly basis, still positive right now, but just look at how much the SOI has actually crashed here in the last several weeks, especially since late March. The latest 30-day average of the SOI is only positive 3, when just a few weeks ago, especially even just, as late as mid-March, we were talking about a 30-day average of the SOI positive 15. So we've seen a huge crash in the SOI recently. And by the way, the SOI is a measure of the pressure patterns in the Pacific, which obviously has a lot to do with how the atmosphere responds. And you can see why we've seen a huge crash of the SOI. A lot of pretty negative daily contribution numbers, obviously weighs down on the average, and that's probably going to continue here over the next several weeks, especially as the MJO moves into the Pacific very, very strongly. And because of that, we're probably going to get pretty decent amount of tropical cyclone activity in the Pacific. And we might actually have quite a number of strong storms. And by the Pacific, I mean, yes, the Western Pacific, we might actually get a pretty strong storm there, but we might also get multiple strong storms in the South Pacific as well, which is still in the Pacific. So obviously, it's still in the influence of the atmosphere responding to a developing El Nino. In fact, we already have 2 systems that were predicted that are ongoing in the South Pacific right now. We have Tropical Storm 30. This is probably going to get a name soon by whatever, monitoring office that monitors the South Pacific. Not exactly sure which office it is, although I do think it is probably based out of Australia, or maybe the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, I'm not sure. And then we also have Tropical Depression 91P, and I'll actually show you the models for this in a little bit, but both storms are expected to become strong. And then we're also going to have a storm form in the Western Pacific too. And why is that? Well, one, strong MJO moving into the Pacific over the next several weeks, which then creates very strong westerly wind bursts here in terms of the zonal wind anomalies. And we've also been going over this quite a lot over the last several weeks. And all of these reds and even some of these browns and even pinks here represent very strong westerly winds in the lower levels of the atmosphere. This helps calm the trades in the Pacific, and especially where these are focused right now in the Western Pacific. So roughly in this region here, obviously very favorable for tropical development. And I did mention to you a few weeks ago, I think it was last week, how usually, especially if we get these very strong westerly wind bursts like we have right now in the Western Pacific, and they end up going on to produce very strong tropical cyclones like typhoons and whatnot, especially like we're going to have here on both sides of the equator, that tends to be a pretty big harbinger of a strong El Nino coming later this year. So it's all coming together, and it's all looking very likely that we're going to get a strong El Nino this year. So, going back to hurricane season, that's obviously going to fuel a less active hurricane season this year, which, going back to the title of this video, is definitely going to be a different scenario than what we've seen over the last several weeks. So everything is coming together. And then obviously, the results of what we're seeing here play out in the Pacific. Just really quickly gonna move very quickly here through the European. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I just want to show you in general the broad scheme of how things are playing out right now. You can see here 2 tropical cyclones probably developing in the next 2 or so days. One of them here, which is already a tropical storm, as I showed you here, this storm right here, Tropical Storm 30. And already they have 30 systems this year. That's pretty wild. You can see it actually gets pretty strong, and it moves very slowly here as well. And that happens as quickly as over just the next 2 days. We might get a very strong system here, and also another very strong system as well, moving to the southeast here. Luckily away from land, although it's probably going to impact some of these islands here in the southern Pacific. But this system in particular will especially be very interesting to watch because it might threaten the country here, the island country of Papua New Guinea. And they have not had a landfalling storm, or at least a very strong landfalling storm, at least as recent history records go, or at least that's what I saw. So this will be a very interesting storm to watch for them, and maybe down the line we might have to watch this for Australia's sake as well. And then we have a very strong storm here. It continues to strengthen as it moves on off to the southeast. So two powerful tropical cyclones going to be produced in the southern Pacific by this westerly wind burst. And then in the western Pacific, on the other hand, let me bring you to the 0Z since it goes out to the next 2 weeks because this happens later down the line. But you notice here, tropical cyclone as well developing in the western Pacific, or as they call it, a typhoon. That also becomes very strong. Probably going to be a very major typhoon. Maybe, who knows, outside chance we might get a super typhoon as well. And that happens over the next 2 weeks. So definitely everything is coming together for this strong El Nino, and you're already beginning to see the atmospheric response, especially as we get multiple powerful typhoons and tropical cyclones going right now already in April in the Pacific. And another way to look at it, especially on a longer range, is by showing you these climate models, as I've been over the last several weeks. And now that it's April, we have new runs of the climate models coming out. First off was the CANCIPS, and this literally came out the first day of April. In fact, it even started running the night before, and I think I did post about it briefly. And I actually mentioned a few things, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment, but just generally showing you how the Pacific is going to play out here over the next several months, at least according to the CANCIPS. You can see very strong El Nino, and this is what the climate models have been suggesting for the past several weeks. And it just continues here, August, September, October. Looks like it probably peaks around September or so, and then kind of wanes a little bit according to the CANCIPS. But interestingly enough, meanwhile, on the other hand, the Atlantic, according to the CANCIPS, is also pretty warm as well, and it actually warms up very significantly, at least according to the model, over the next several months. See, it goes here from where we are in April right now, and let me actually really quickly bring you to the Atlantic slide, just so you can get a better idea, not, have to like go really close to the screen and squint to see the Atlantic. But here's the CANCIPS in the Atlantic, as we have strong El Nino developing in the Pacific. Very interestingly enough here, the CANCIPS has the Atlantic warming up quite a bit. In fact, we see some pretty warm anomalies here develop by September. And yeah, it is kind of concentrated in the subtropics. Usually, especially in order to get the signal that this year is going to be really, really active, you would want to see these anomalies a little bit more concentrated in the deep tropics. But it's still warm for the most part. And that warmth pretty much persists as we head into the end of the year in the Atlantic. And as a result, take a look at the precip values here in the Atlantic, especially as we get towards August and September. That doesn't really look like a super inactive hurricane season, especially compared to what some of the expectations are showing. So this might be another interesting scenario to watch. And the best analog I could bring up for maybe a scenario like what the CANCIPS is showing here is 2023. Just a few years ago, the last time we had a pretty significant El Nino, the Atlantic was still active that hurricane season. Just really goes to show how active the Atlantic has been over the last pretty much decade at this point. We were even active in a El Nino year, let alone a strong El Nino year. And looks like the CANCIPS is trying to do that, or trying to hint at a similar scenario for this year. And obviously, one of the number one helping aspects as to why is the fact that they have a very, very warm Atlantic. So that'll be a very interesting scenario to watch here over the next several months. And, actually, Just to show you another parameter, look at the shear as well. Also pretty low according to the CANSIPs, although you do see we still have some higher than normal shear values in the Caribbean, obviously because of the atmospheric influence still kind of being El Nino-like. But that looks like pretty low shear. That looks like quite a bit of above normal precip values. So maybe is the CANSIPs onto something, and maybe will this year be a little different than what we think in terms of this year being a different kind of year because of El Nino. We'll see. Still a lot to go over the next several months, but I will say that the CANSIPs is right now an outlier. All the other models kind of have a classic inactive Atlantic look as this strong El Nino really kicks into high gear. We'll see how everybody sees it, especially since we're going to have seasonal forecasts come out next week, especially by people like Colorado State, which is very respected. So we'll see what they say. We'll see if they looked at the CANSIPs and incorporated that into their forecast or not. We'll go over it all next week. But with that being said, that's going to do it for this week's video. Looks like we're going to have a different hurricane season coming up. And whether or not that'll be true, well, we're going to see how it all plays out very shortly here. We are now just several weeks away from the hurricane season. And trust me, time from now till hurricane season is going to fly by very, very quickly. So make sure you start preparing now. Even though this year is expected to be below normal, still prepare because, as the saying goes, it only takes one to make a hurricane season big, even if the rest of the season is inactive. And we've even seen that as well over the last several years. So keep that in mind and prepare, and hurricane season will be here before you know it. But that's going to do it once again for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, I would really recommend if you like this video, subscribe to my channel, because we'll continue to do these weekly outlooks every single week until we get to around mid-May, when hurricane season really begins to ramp up. Then we're going to start doing these videos much more on a daily basis, so hope you stick around for that. But with that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend as well. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. Hope to see you back here again next week.